There is a particular kind of disappearance that nobody notices right away. A man arrives at a boarding house on a fog-heavy Tennessee ridge with bags in his hand and a few coins in his pocket, and he signs his name in a ledger before sitting down to a warm meal. Then he's just gone, but not in the way travelers usually go when they move on to the next town or the next job. 20 men signed that ledger, and not one of them ever checked out. Yet the woman who ran the house smiled at every new arrival with a look as steady and warm as a hearth fire. Nobody thought to ask why she never seemed to grieve a single departure, or why the room stayed so quiet after the lanterns went out. To understand what happened inside that house, you first have to understand the land that surrounded it. Appalachian Tennessee in 1910 wasn't remote the way a map makes a place look empty, but it was remote the way a closed door is remote.
You could stand right outside that door and still have no idea what was happening on the other side, because the ridges ran long and steep. The hollows between those peaks cut off sound and sight, and they destroyed the kind of casual community oversight you find in flat country towns, where your neighbor's front porch faces your own. Men moved through this country constantly during those years. Traveling salesmen, or drummers as people called them back then, hauled sample cases full of dry goods and patent medicines across the ridges. Seasonal workers drifted between coal camps as the seams opened and closed, and other men followed rumors of work, or followed nothing at all. These were men without fixed addresses, whose families back in Knoxville or Chattanooga might not expect a letter for weeks, or even months at a time. The infrastructure to track any of these travelers simply didn't exist in the mountains.
There were no hotels in the smaller communities, and no telegraph offices where a worried wife could send an inquiry to find a missing husband. Boarding houses were the whole system, consisting of private homes where a woman with a spare room and a wood stove could take in travelers for $1 or $2 a night. A man arrived and paid his way, and then he left when he said he would, without anyone checking anything but the weather. The Blackwood Widow fit into this world the way a key fits a lock. She was recently bereaved when she opened the house to boarders, her husband having died a year or two prior, under circumstances that seemed unremarkable for a man worn down by mountain life. The county knew her as quiet and capable, and she kept a tidy house while cooking the kind of meals that made men feel at home. She didn't ask her boarders too many questions, which was a trait that men, moving through strange country, tended to appreciate. In Victorian Appalachia, widowhood came with a particular kind of social armor that protected a woman from the prying eyes of her neighbors. Grief gave her permission to be left alone and to manage her own affairs, and she could turn away curiosity with a look that suggested she had already suffered enough. Nobody pressed a widow or made her explain herself, so the community extended a protective silence around her that she lived inside quite comfortably. What her neighbors did notice was the garden, and they noticed it long before they let themselves think too hard about what it actually meant. Most people on that ridge fought the soil the way you fight something that refuses to cooperate, dealing with clay-heavy and rock-threaded ground that needed breaking every single season. The soil behind her house was dark and loose, like the rich bottomland you find along a river, and her beds grew so heavy that neighboring farm women eventually asked what she was doing differently. She told them it was the compost, and because she was a widow, nobody pushed her for a better answer. Every boarding house in those days kept a ledger, and it was more than just a notebook. It was how a woman tracked who owed what, how she settled a dispute if a man claimed he'd already paid his way, and how she kept the basic arithmetic of a working household from sliding into a shouting match. The Blackwood Widow kept hers exactly the way she kept her kitchen, neat, careful, and consistent. You could see the names written in a steady hand alongside the dates of arrival and the amount paid, all organized into columns that looked perfectly ordinary at first glance. But there was one thing the ledger was missing, and once you saw it, you couldn't look at anything else. There wasn't a departure column. In all those pages of records, there was not a single entry showing a date when a guest actually packed his bags and left. When investigators eventually laid that book open on a heavy courthouse table, the absence of those dates felt almost deliberate. like a sentence that just stops before it reaches the final word. Across several years of operation, 20 names were listed in those pages. 20 arrivals were documented with care. But after the money was recorded, the ink just stopped. The story of every man who stayed there ended the very moment he crossed her threshold and put his coins on the table. The men who stayed with her fit a very specific profile, and that wasn't by accident. There were drummers out of Knoxville and Chattanooga who carried sample cases of goods they would never actually deliver to a customer. You had seasonal coal workers moving between camps with their wages in their pockets and no fixed address to call home. These were men drifting west or south looking for work that might not have even existed, and they were the kind of people whose disappearance had a built-in explanation. People just assumed they had moved on, because that was what men in their position did. Their families, if they even had them, were already used to long, heavy silences between letters. The timing of these stays mattered just as much as the men themselves. Most of the guests who arrived during the winter months never resulted in an inquiry from the outside world. When the mountain passes closed up with snow, a man's route became impossible to trace with any kind of certainty. He could have headed north or south, or even looped back toward the east, but nobody could say for sure what road he'd taken out of that hollow. In January and February, half those mountain roads were barely passable anyway. A man who vanished in the dead of winter had the weather as his alibi, which also happened to be the widow's alibi. One specific account that came up during the investigation involved a salesman out of Knoxville who sold dry goods across the eastern Tennessee circuit. His family had a rough idea of which route he worked and how long a normal run should take him. When he didn't walk through his own front door, they waited 2 weeks before they started asking questions. The inquiry eventually found its way to a county deputy through a long chain of letters, each one passed along to the next person who might have seen him last. When the law finally asked the widow about him, she said he'd paid his bill and mentioned he had people in the next county over. She told them he left before she'd even come downstairs to start breakfast, and she acted truly sorry that she couldn't be of more help. It was a good answer, because it was detailed enough to feel like a real memory, but it was vague enough that nobody could ever disprove it. That was the pattern they found. Not just one story, but the exact same story told 20 different ways to anyone who asked. He paid and left early, or he said he had somewhere he needed to be, or he mentioned some kinfolk she didn't know the names of. Each explanation was delivered with the mild, tired tone of a woman who was being asked to remember a minor detail from months ago. There was nothing inflammatory in her voice, and nothing that invited a follow-up question. The handwriting in that book is worth talking about, mostly because the investigators couldn't stop looking at it. The arrival entries were written in a full, confident hand, with a pen moved with the ease of someone recording a fact in real time. But in several places where departure information had been squeezed in later, the ink was lighter and thinner. It looked as if the pen had been picked up again after a long pause, long after the original entry had already dried on the paper. Those little notes like "left before dawn" or "settled his account" didn't read like records at all. They felt like additions to a story that was being filled in after the fact. The ledger wasn't proof of a crime by itself, because a missing column isn't a felony, and light ink isn't a confession. But it was the shape of something dark, and the garden was about to give that shape a physical body. The garden was the very first thing a person saw when they came around the east side of the house. It ran the entire length of the back lot, in long, orderly rows of beans, squash, and root vegetables, with a small stand of herbs growing right near the kitchen door. The front beds looked neighborly enough, being the kind of garden any decent Appalachian homestead would keep to get through the year. But behind the fence she'd built across the middle of the yard, the beds were deeper and the growth was much thicker.
The smell on a warm afternoon was something the neighbors remembered, though they couldn't quite put a name to it until much later. Farmers in that part of Tennessee understood the soil the same way you understand a language you've spoken since you were a child. They knew exactly what clay felt like under a boot heel, and they knew what rocky ground meant for a seedling's first 2 weeks of life. They understood what it took to coax anything worth eating out of mountain earth that had been growing nothing but forest for 1,000 years. Dark, loose, nitrogen-heavy soil didn't just show up on a ridge like that by itself. It had to be made, and making it required adding something back into the earth, something organic that would break down slowly and feed the ground from underneath. The neighbors knew what that kind of rich earth meant, and most of them had figured it out the way you figure out something you'd rather not say out loud. They realized it slowly and at a distance, usually turning their eyes away before the thought could fully form in their minds. One woman, who lived about a quarter-mile down the road, came by in the spring of a year the investigators later tried to identify. She was carrying a cutting of climbing roses she thought the widow might want for her fence. She walked around the back of the house and called out a greeting, but she got close enough to the far beds that the smell hit her before she could prepare for it. It was sweet and wrong, the way something always is when it's been sitting out in the heat too long. She handed over the roses and accepted a cup of water. Then she walked home without ever mentioning what she'd noticed. She didn't tell her husband that night, and she didn't tell a soul for 3 years. When she finally did speak about it, she cried, not because she felt guilty, but because of the weight of knowing something her mind wouldn't let her fully accept. A boy from a neighboring farm once saw the widow digging late at night, long past the hour when anyone with a normal reason for gardening would still be out there. He was only 12 or 13 at the time, cutting home through the tree line after an errand had run late into the evening. She was working by the light of a lantern in that back section, the area behind the fence she always kept latched. He didn't stop to talk, and he didn't say a word, but he did tell his mother he'd seen her out there. His mother just told him that some women found comfort in their chores, and that was the end of the conversation. The widow never let a single person help her with those garden beds. Every neighborly offer was turned down gently, with that same mild tone she used for everything else in her life. She dug deep, much deeper than vegetables ever required, and deeper than any reasonable person would dig just to prepare the soil. The rows were spaced wide apart, and the earth between them was always freshly turned, almost as if something down below kept shifting and needed to be pressed back down. When the deputy finally arrived with a warrant and 2 men to help him work the ground, he started at the front beds because that seemed like the orderly way to do things. He found vegetables there, and when he moved to the middle section, he found plants with better root systems than he'd ever seen on that rocky Tennessee ground. He eventually unlatched the back fence because he had a legal warrant and a growing sense of something he didn't want to name. The very first thing they turned up with their shovels was a leather boot, and that boot still had a foot inside it. They kept digging through what was left of that afternoon and well into the next morning. By the time they finished working the back section of that garden, the community's long, careful silence was over. Everything they had half known and chosen not to say had become a reality they would have to live with for the rest of their lives. The garden hadn't just grown well on its own. It had been fed. Silence in Appalachia isn't the same thing as ignorance. That's the part people from outside these mountains tend to miss when they hear a story like this one and ask, almost reflexively, why nobody said anything sooner. It's as if they think the answer is simple, or as if the whole community had just failed to notice what was happening right in front of them. They noticed. Several of them had noticed for years. The question was never about knowledge, but rather what you do with that knowledge when acting on it means accusing a widow of something so far outside the understood order of things that the accusation itself would mark you forever. In a small mountain community, the person who makes a terrible claim carries that weight for the rest of their life, whether the story turns out to be true or not. You could be entirely right and still spend the next 20 years being known as the woman who said those awful things about the widow up the hollow.
So people managed what they knew the way mountain people have always managed hard things, which is to say, they carried it quietly, kept it close, and told themselves that what they'd seen probably had another explanation they just hadn't thought of yet. The woman with the rose cutting wasn't the only one harboring a secret. There was a man who'd sold the widow a load of quicklime one winter, far more than any garden would ever need, and when he mentioned it to his wife later that week, she told him that was her own business, and he ought to let it alone.
There was also a family that lived close enough to hear her working some nights. The sound of a spade turning stony ground, carrying strange and clear in the cold air. And they'd talked about it once between themselves, and then agreed, without saying so directly, never to speak of it again. The boy who'd seen her digging by lantern light had grown into a young man by the time any of this came to a head. He mentioned it to at least 2 people before the law got involved, though neither of them was in a position to do much with the information. One was a friend his own age who shrugged it off, while the other was a preacher who told him to pray for the widow and leave her to God's judgment. God's judgment, as it turned out, was slower than a letter from Chattanooga. That letter came from a salesman's wife who'd been writing inquiries for months without getting anywhere. Her husband had been working the eastern Tennessee circuit, and the last anyone had placed him with any certainty was at a supply house about 30 miles from the widow's ridge. This wife was not the kind of woman who accepted "he probably just moved on" as a complete answer, and she'd been applying steady, methodical pressure on whoever would receive her letters. When her second inquiry landed on the desk of the county deputy, it landed right on top of a first inquiry he'd already half forgotten about a different missing man. 2 families, 2 missing men, the same stretch of road. The deputy's name doesn't survive the historical record cleanly, but what does survive is the account of his reluctance to act. He'd known the widow's late husband and had sat at that family's table many times, so the woman he remembered didn't match the shape of what the accumulated rumors were starting to suggest. He spent several days finding reasons why it probably wasn't what it looked like, trying to convince himself there was a logical explanation. Then he rode up the hollow and knocked on her door, and she opened it wide and asked if he'd like coffee, before he'd said a single word about why he'd come. Something in that readiness, that absolute and unruffled calm, settled in his chest in a way that coffee couldn't fix. He rode back down that afternoon and started writing a report. Rural Tennessee in 1910 didn't have a procedure for something like this. There was no forensics unit, no standardized evidence protocol, and no photographs that a court would accept as proof of anything. What existed was a sheriff, a deputy, a warrant, and however many men they could pull together to turn dirt on a cold morning. The law in that county ran on personal authority and community standing, and those 2 things were about to collide directly with the widow's own considerable store of both. The sheriff came with the deputy the second time. They arrived mid-morning, which was a deliberate choice to ensure they had enough light to work by and enough time that the day wouldn't run out before they'd finished. She met them at the door the same way she'd met the deputy alone, which is to say, she met them completely without alarm. She took their coats and told them the coffee was already on. The sheriff later told the county prosecutor that her composure was the first thing that genuinely unsettled him. Not because calm people can't be innocent, but because he'd delivered bad news to innocent people before, and they always looked at least slightly uncertain about what was coming. She didn't look uncertain about anything. They started inside because the warrant covered the full property, and because starting inside gave them a reason to be thorough without immediately going to the garden. What they found in the main rooms was ordinary. Just a clean, well-kept house with modest furniture and nothing out of place. But off the back hallway there was a room with a padlock on the outside of the door, which is not where a padlock usually lives. Inside that room sat 3 leather traveling bags that didn't belong to a widow. There was a sample case still packed with dry goods, the kind a drummer would carry, and 2 coats too large for any woman's frame,
hanging on wall pegs, as if their owners had just stepped out for a moment and planned to be right back. A pocket watch with someone's initials scratched into the case lay there as well. The sheriff laid each item out on the hallway floor and wrote down what he was looking at, moving slowly because he needed the writing to keep his hands occupied. The ledger was in the kitchen, sitting on a shelf between a receipt book and a tin of medicinal herbs.
He recognized immediately what it was and what it wasn't, seeing a business record with arrivals carefully noted, and no departures anywhere in it. He'd heard the deputy's account of the handwriting before he came, but seeing it in person was a different thing entirely. The lighter ink in the notes column looked less like a woman adding information, and more like a woman constructing a cover story, one line at a time, across years. She sat in the front room while they worked, and answered every question they put to her. The answers were the same ones the deputy had already collected, claiming he paid and left, or he mentioned kin, or he was gone before she ever came down. Her words were delivered in the same mild, slightly tired tone, as if she were recounting the minor movements of guests she'd never expected to see again, and couldn't be fairly blamed for not tracking. The sheriff wrote her answers down until he had several pages of them.
At some point he stopped writing and just listened, because the counting had started in his head, and it was taking up the space that the note-taking had been using. The garden took the better part of 2 days to search. The front sections, as the deputy had already found, held nothing unusual. The back section, behind the fence she'd kept latched and private, held what the ledger had been quietly accounting for all along. The remains the excavation turned up were in varying states of decomposition, some so far along that individual identification was beyond what 1910 rural Tennessee could manage. Personal effects were buried close to the surface, as if depth had mattered less than coverage. A boot, a wallet with the leather dried stiff, and buttons from a type of coat sold to traveling men all came out of the earth. The sheriff stopped counting bodies at some point and started counting the names in the ledger instead, working backward through the pages, matching what the ground was giving up against what her handwriting had recorded. The numbers weren't going to balance. In 1910, the state of Tennessee rarely put a woman on trial for murder, and that is not a defense of how things worked back then, but rather an explanation of the uphill battle the prosecution faced before the first witness even spoke. The legal system was built around a very specific idea of what a killer looked like, and a soft-spoken widow with a clean house and dirt-free fingernails did not fit the image any juror was ready to accept. The prosecutor understood this challenge perfectly, so he built his entire case around 3 things he could actually set on the table in front of the jury. He focused on the ledger, the physical evidence pulled from the garden, and the testimony of neighbors who had stayed quiet for years and were now speaking with the heavy regret of people who knew they should have acted sooner. The ledger was the first thing the jury saw, because it was the most logical piece of the puzzle. The prosecutor walked through the arrivals one by one, reading off a name, a date, and the amount of money paid, and then he simply let the silence of the empty departure columns do the talking for him. He did not have to explain what was missing from those pages, because the jury could see the blank spaces for themselves, and he let them sit in that uncomfortable realization for a long time before he moved on to the next point. Presenting the physical evidence was a much more difficult task for the state. While the garden had given up its secrets, matching specific bones to the names written in that ledger was nearly impossible given the limited tools available in rural Tennessee at the turn of the century. The prosecution could prove that a large number of human remains were buried on the property, and they could show the jury personal items, like a sample case, several coats, and a pocket watch with initials that a family from Knoxville later confirmed belonged to their missing son. However, they could not draw a straight line from every name in the book to a body in the dirt, and the defense lawyers realized this weakness and attacked it every chance they got. The defense did not try to deny that bodies were found,
because the excavation had made that impossible. Instead, they offered a different story about a lonely widow living on a remote ridge who took in boarders who were already sick or dying by the time they reached her door.
These were men worn down by the brutal mountain winters and the kinds of diseases that spread through groups of travelers. And the defense argued that when they died, a woman living all by herself had no choice but to bury them on her own land. It was a story that asked the jury to believe in a staggering number of coincidences happening in a single garden. But it had its own internal logic, and the defense stuck to it until the very end. When the neighbor who had taken the rose cutting finally took the stand, she described the smell that had hung over the fence, and admitted she had said nothing for 3 years. The jury watched her break down in tears as she confessed that she hadn't let herself believe what was happening, and the courtroom fell into the kind of heavy silence that you only hear when something truly terrible is being revealed.
To finish their case, the deputy read every single name from the ledger aloud, and the names of men whose families were still waiting for letters that would never arrive filled the room until the weight of their absence was impossible to ignore. The jury consisted of 12 local men who had mostly known the widow's husband when he was still alive. They stayed behind closed doors for the better part of 2 days, which was long enough to show they were struggling with the decision, but short enough to prove the evidence had made an impact. When the verdict was finally read, they found her guilty on the counts where the physical evidence was the most undeniable. The sentence the judge handed down was considered harsh for the time, but it reflected a court that was trying to make sense of how a woman they thought they knew could be responsible for the things they had seen pulled from the earth. The legal case was over, and the records were filed away, but the hollow itself did not find peace quite so easily. There are some hollows in Appalachia that change forever after a tragedy like this one. People start to leave quietly, moving away when a place stops feeling like a home and starts feeling like a dark memory they have to face every time they open their eyes in the morning. A few families living along that ridge did exactly that in the years following the trial, selling off what they could and packing the rest to put the mountain between themselves and the soil where those men had been found. Most of the families stayed right where they were, because that is what people in these mountains have always done. It isn't necessarily about being stubborn, but rather because a life in a mountain hollow is built in layers of history, from the family graves on the hillside to the root cellars your grandfather dug with his own hands. You don't just walk away from a century of work because something awful happened down the road. So you absorb the story into the land, and you keep going. The boarding house sat empty for a long time because nobody wanted to put their name on the deed or move their children into those rooms. The garden was overtaken by weeds much faster than anyone thought possible, almost as if the earth was trying to hide what had happened and return to a more honest state. Within 10 years, the fences had rotted away, and the garden beds were lost in the brush, and the house began the slow lean toward the ground as the roof sagged and the ridge started to take back the wood and stone. Eventually, the entire building collapsed and disappeared. No one really knows exactly when it happened, or who might have helped it along, and that kind of thing doesn't usually make it into the official county history books. The house just wasn't there anymore one spring, and the people who lived nearby didn't feel the need to talk about where it went. What those families did instead was what Appalachian people have always done with the history they can't talk about in public. They told the story at kitchen tables in low voices, passing the account of the widow and her garden down from parents to children and then to grandchildren. The details might have shifted over the decades, and the names were sometimes changed, but the core of the story stayed the same, because it was information the community felt was important to remember, even if it wasn't safe to write down. As it turns out, the Blackwood Widow was not the only person doing this kind of thing during that era. There are records of similar crimes at boarding houses all across rural America.
usually run by women who realized that the men most likely to disappear, without anyone asking questions, were the ones who didn't have a permanent home to begin with. These predatory houses were a known problem that newspapers eventually started covering, though the news usually only broke after the number of victims had become too large for the local authorities to ignore. What made this specific case stand out wasn't the way she did it, but how long she kept it going, and the sheer scale of what she left behind. She operated for years and filled a ledger with 20 different names, tending a garden that had become famous for its beauty because of what she was putting into the soil. Most people in her shoes would have burned that ledger the moment the law came knocking, but she kept it right on her kitchen shelf, between a book of receipts and a tin of dried herbs. It was as if the act of writing down those names had become a habit she couldn't break, even when keeping that book was the one thing that would surely send her to prison. There were 11 names in that ledger that the investigators could never match to a body or a missing person report. Those men never had a family call to ask about them, and they left no trace behind except for a single arrival date and a small amount of money written in a column that stayed empty forever. Those 11 men are the part of the story that the mountains decided to keep for themselves. To understand what happened in that house, you have to start with who this woman was on paper to every neighbor who saw her passing by. She was a widow and a respected member of the community who had buried a husband and then made the quiet choice to support herself instead of leaning on her kin for help. Running a boarding house was considered respectable work for a woman in those days, and it was the kind of domestic labor that didn't require her to step outside the narrow roles the county already approved of. She spent her days cooking, cleaning, and keeping rooms, which meant that everything she did in public fit the mold of what a woman in 1910 rural Tennessee was supposed to be. Because she performed those duties so well, her public respectability sat in front of her private life like a heavy locked gate that no one thought to look behind. Criminologists who look back at female killers from this era often talk about something called the invisibility of competence, and it is a chilling concept to consider. The idea is that the more perfectly a woman managed the expected performance of her life, the scrubbed floors, the hot meals, and that tired, mild manner she used when people asked questions, the less room anyone around her had to imagine she was capable of anything else. She wasn't hiding her crimes behind a mask of chaos or incompetence, but was actually hiding them behind a mask of excellence. That is a much harder thing for the human mind to see through, because excellence doesn't make us suspicious. It makes us offer our trust without a second thought. That boarding house gave her a level of structural control that most people who intend to do harm can only dream of having. She was the one who decided who stayed and who had to leave, and she controlled the schedule, the food, and the knowledge of exactly how much cash each boarder was carrying in his pockets. Every bit of information that entered or left that property went through her first, from the people who knocked on the door to the stories she told the neighbors about her guests. A boarding house run by a single woman in a remote hollow is one of the most controlled environments you can imagine, mostly because the woman in charge is the sole gatekeeper, and the guests have no right to question her rules. When it came to choosing her victims, she looked for men who wouldn't be missed by anyone who might come looking for them. This wasn't some random streak of bad luck, but a calculated selection of traveling men and transient workers whose social ties were loose enough that a long silence wouldn't set off any alarms. The pattern historians find in cases like this shows a very functional logic about which disappearances the world would just absorb without asking questions. She understood exactly where the gaps in accountability lived in that society, and she used those gaps to her advantage for years. The garden was perhaps the most elegant part of the whole operation, if you can use such a beautiful word for something so dark. It was a domestic space that was visible to everyone, and entirely unremarkable as an activity. Yet it solved the only real practical problem her business created. The physical evidence of what she had done didn't need to be moved or hidden in the woods where she couldn't watch it. Instead, it went right into the ground she tended every day, and it presented itself to the neighborhood as a sign of her hard work and industry. The fact that the evidence actually made her garden grow better wasn't an accident, but was the cold logic of a system that was entirely self-contained and self-sustaining. The ledger she kept is much harder to explain through simple calculation, especially since she had absolutely no legal reason to keep those records. She documented every arrival with care, but the departures were left blank. And if she had just burned that book, the investigators would have had almost nothing to use against her.
Yet she kept that ledger sitting on an open shelf in her kitchen for years, and it's hard to believe she simply forgot how dangerous those pages were. It seems more likely that she needed that record for some internal reason, perhaps as a way to keep order, or to have a private accounting of her own power. Her need for control didn't just stop at the front door. It extended inward to the way she tracked her own history. By the time the law arrived, she had clearly convinced herself that this whole arrangement made perfect sense. That famous composure she showed under pressure, even while sipping her coffee and giving mild answers to the sheriff, wasn't the look of an innocent woman. It was the look of someone who had settled on an internal logic years ago, and had long since stopped questioning whether what she was doing was right or wrong. The trial eventually answered the legal questions of guilt and innocence, but it never came close to answering the questions that actually matter. The prosecution told the jury that money was the motive, because that was a reason a group of men in 1910 could understand without having to think about anything too uncomfortable. They argued that the boarders paid in cash, and a widow living alone always had a use for more money. And while that logic was enough to get a conviction, it falls apart if you look at the actual numbers. The small amounts of cash these men carried, a week of earnings for a drummer or a coal worker's pay, don't add up to a fortune that justifies years of such a meticulous and dangerous operation. You simply don't kill 20 people for the pocket change of a traveling salesman, unless there is something else driving you. Whatever was actually pushing her went much deeper than the columns in a ledger. But she was careful never to let anyone see what was truly in her heart. During her own testimony, there were moments where the wall she built around herself started to show a few cracks. She described some of those borders with a level of detail that didn't fit the cold, indifferent person she claimed to be. She remembered what one man said over his supper, and how another talked about his family back home, which are details a woman who didn't care about her guests would have forgotten instantly. She had listened to them, and she remembered them, and somewhere between the dinner table and the garden, something moved in her that she chose to keep hidden forever. After the investigation became public, several men who had stayed at her house and made it out alive were interviewed by the authorities. They described her as a quiet and attentive woman who didn't ask many questions, but seemed to soak up every word they said in response. One man recalled feeling that she was just a lonely woman looking for company, while another admitted he had planned to return, but changed his route at the last minute for a reason he couldn't quite name. Neither of those stories is proof of a crime, but they feel like the edges of a much larger truth that we will never be able to name clearly. The people living in that hollow never really found peace with what happened, mostly because peace requires a full accounting that was never going to happen. Instead, the community was left with the heavy weight of knowing that their own silence and politeness had likely cost the lives of men they couldn't even name. These were men who saw a warm light in a window on a cold mountain night and trusted the woman who opened the door. That weight didn't just go away after the trial, but it settled into the ridges like the winter cold settles into the stone, becoming a part of the landscape that is impossible to ignore. The very last entry in that ledger was just a name, a date, and the amount the man had paid for his stay. There was no note in the margin, and no explanation written in lighter ink to tell us what happened to him. It was just a record of an arrival, sitting at the bottom of the final page, and it remains as permanent and unanswered as every other name written above it.
The question this story leaves us with, the one that lingers long after the verdict and the garden are gone, is how many other houses like hers were scattered along these dark ridges. We have to wonder how many other ledgers recorded arrivals in a careful hand and then fell silent. It's likely that many of those books were thrown into the hearth and burned before anyone ever thought to ask a question, with the smoke drifting up into the mountain air and taking those names with it. The mountains don't give up those kinds of secrets. They just hold on to them. The garden has turned back to scrub, and the ledger is either sitting in a dusty evidence file or lost to time, as nobody can say for sure. What remains is the shape of a story about a woman who knew exactly which men the world chose to ignore, and she built her entire life around that dark secret for years before anyone bothered to look at what she was growing. If you want more stories from the deep shadows of these mountains, you should subscribe and stay close. And make sure to share this one with anyone who thinks they already know what Appalachia is hiding.